So, 1 year after the Washington Accords, does Armenia have an elevated degree of agency in determining its future now?
Well, yes. When we consider kind of, where we were at, where we're going, what we're able to achieve, there's definitely an elevated degree of agency. And when you say that, what does that mean, right? What this basically means is, if the prior system that we had in the region that was Russia dominated, and the other one always had to pick up the phone, call the Kremlin to get permission to do something, that has changed. So note that we're not talking about absolute agency because that would be a little dishonest, right? You're a small country in a very dangerous neighborhood with big actors playing around, so you're not always going to have this level of autonomy that we would like. But at the end of the day, Armenia is able to make a lot more decisions for its foreign and security policy and economic policy that we're currently able to do than we were in the past. So, in that context, definitely Armenia is able to exercise a lot more agency that we've known since the early 90s.
So, it doesn't have to pick up the phone and call DC now?
Not really. I guess the only time you would have to call the phone, they pick up the phone, call DC, assuming they'll pick up the phone, is if there's a threat, right? Or if, Aliyev is back to his old tricks of threatening Armenia or posing in sort of an imminent threat. So, the way DC functions is they're the most powerful country in the world. They cannot be picking up 160 phone calls a day, 150 phone calls a day, all the other countries in the world that want that access. So the relationship, the structure is very, very different. What Armenia does right now is we have a mutually aligned set of interests with the United States in basically being able to establish some level of stability, normalization in the region, and advancing regional projects, which are good for Armenia and from America's perspective, good for their interests. So that's kind of what we're looking at, right? So there's definitely coordination, there's definitely conversations, but at the end of the day, it's not as if, if Armenia wanted to change a judge or two in the past, the Kremlin wasn't happy, those judges weren't going anywhere. Or if a general had to be removed for corruption, if the Kremlin wasn't happy, that wasn't going to happen. That's not where we're at with the United States, right? The U.S. isn't going to get involved in that, all those kind of sort of internal minutiae and things. So, as a country, right, you're able to exercise more agency, more autonomy, and slowly strengthen your sovereignty. So, like I said, we're not in a position where we could say we're fully autonomous and sovereign and blah blah blah. That'll be dishonest. But at least we're basically making important strides. And this is kind of what we're seeing in the region with the Washington Accords and all with the developments we have with the U.S., the stabilization process, and with the movement on TRIPP.
Okay. Um, the reason why we're having this conversation is because it has been a year now since the Washington Accords. And you wrote something that was, I mean, very obvious, but sometimes when something is very obvious, you don't pay so much attention to it. That the Accords achieved something that Armenia was not able to do on its own over, the last 2, 3 decades, and that is peace on the ground, the absence of war, the absence of skirmishes on the border. While Aliyev still might, be having some bellicose rhetoric now and again, we in the last 2 years we have not seen any of that happening. So that was really interesting to me that it was able to achieve something that we couldn't have done on our own.
Absolutely. There's a lot of attention on the nuances of TRIPP, for example. Absolutely. We should sort of, litigate those, debate those, so on and so forth. And there's some discourse of, why didn't we get X where we could have gotten Y? And, it's the usual Armenian habit of demanding things where in reality you had no chance of getting those things, right? But be that as it may. But my point is, when we look at the Washington Accords, yes, TRIPP is one important part of it. It's the cornerstone, but it's not the only part of the Washington Accords. We had all these MOUs from high tech to interconnectivity projects to tech to energy and all that stuff, which is basically playing a role in strengthening Armenia's agency capacity and all those things. So this is a systemic approach to advancing Armenia's interests, and it's not simply about that one road or what that one road would look like. Again, that is a very big part of it, but it's not the only part of it. And so we have a lot of these discussions about these things, which is excellent. But what most forget in these nuanced conversations is the fact that we went from being in survival mode to actually now debating nuances of policy or strategy, which is a wonderful thing. But we don't want to forget the fact, right, as you noted, for 20 years, our biggest concern was how do we contain Aliyev's belligerent behavior? And in the last 2 years, right, and especially in the last year, ever since the Washington Accords, and as I've noted in my writings, the system in the South Caucasus has shifted. So the things that Aliyev was able to do in the past, the things that he was able to get away with, he is not able to do that now. Not because Aliyev all of a sudden became a humanitarian, not because he's less bellicose or less war prone. No, it's because he understands he operates in a system right now that is led by the United States, which would punish that kind of behavior. So, in the previous system that was Russia dominated, things like fracture, conflict persistent, militarizations, that system incentivized that kind of behavior. So, Aliyev engaged in that kind of behavior to maximize his gains. In the post Russia or new US system that we have in the South Caucasus, right, which was ushered in through the Washington Accords, that kind of behavior will be punished because the system is not defined by those attributes that we had in the past, but things like stability, interconnectivity, trade. And so now states are incentivized to engage in that kind of behavior. And so Aliyev is disincentivized from being engaging in belligerence. And he understands that very well. So he's playing his cards very, very cleverly. So the important thing for us to understand when we talk about the accords, and as I noted, TRIPP, this, that, economics, which are all extremely important. But at the end of the day, what we need to realize is that the accords changed the geopolitical system of the South Caucasus. And so, if many people are kind of thinking, why did Aliyev go from talking about conquering southern Sunik or doing whatever he wanted to all of a sudden not even firing a single bullet, right, for the last year and a half or 2 years? What explains that? Well, this is what explains it, right? The change in the system. And so he understands that he needs to change his behavior or else he will have complications. The rules of the game have changed. The important thing is how well Armenia now plays this new game to advance our strategic interests.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question. So this new system that's constraining belligerence in the region has given Armenia the breathing space, and we've been talking about this for the last 2 years actually, that we just need some breathing space to be able to, um, from re-articulating security architecture to improving the military, the armed forces, our borders. The question is Armenia re-articulating its security architecture? And I ask this because we're coming off the heels, and I don't know if they're related or not related, of a number of non-combat deaths that are happening in the armed forces, and this has led to a lot of conversations, a lot of concerns in Armenian society, where somebody said today that not a single bullet has been shot across the border yet in the last, what, I think 2 weeks we've had three non-combat deaths. So the concern is that, are we using this breathing space appropriately to do what we need to do in case, I don't know, the geopolitical situation shifts again?
That's an excellent question. The geopolitical situation at some point will shift. No system is eternal, right? And so, whether it's going to be, let's say, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, these kind of systems last for about 2 decades. The Russian system lasted about for 2 decades. But, with what we call the acceleration of history, let's say the current one doesn't last 2 decades, it lasts a decade, whatever the case might be, right? But Armenia still has breathing room. So, we have to understand the fact that we cannot basically slow down what we're doing under the assumption that the system's different and this is going to continue in perpetuity. That's one. The question that you pose is an excellent one, but it's not a geopolitical or systemic question, meaning the system constrains Aliyev's behavior. Very good. Azerbaijan cannot attack Armenia right now, even if Aliyev wanted to. Excellent. What is Armenia doing during this breathing space that we have to advance its capabilities as a sovereign developing state? And that basically is reduced to a single genesis: institutional capacity and reforms. So, what you are talking about, what everyone is rightfully talking about, right? Non combat vets that we're having in the military, where you haven't had any violence across the border, yet we're seeing vets, is a byproduct of institutional underdevelopment. Professional institutions don't have these kinds of things. Developed institutions don't have these kind of things. Yes, of course, accidents happen, right? A Black Hawk helicopter crashes, U.S. soldiers die. Things happen in France, in the UK, right? I mean, in the military, it's going to happen. But with ours, it's not so much accidents, right? But an issue of institutional underdevelopment and a problem of institutional culture. Armenia's military isn't professionalized, right? So we can buy all the weapons. Okay, we can bring all the elite strategists from our, Western partners to develop capacity, strategies, so on and so forth. But if the culture is still defined by the old Russo-Soviet methods of hazing, right, of sort of the pseudo criminal street culture that we see, in the yards of Yerevan or whatever the case might be, and that transitions itself into the military. That is a textbook case of underdevelopment and under professionalization. Those issues need to be addressed regardless of geopolitical systems. These are internal institutional issues. So, in that context, our problem right now is institutional underdevelopment, which is producing these kinds of things because professional soldiers don't behave that way. Professional commanders don't behave that way, right? Professional leaders do not allow that kind of behavior. So we have to accept the fact that a lot of the middle management in our military aren't sufficiently professionalized because they either graduate the Russian school, which everybody knows is unprofessional, or they grew up in the ranks in Armenia through the 90s into the 2000s under a system that was inherently corrupt and underdeveloped. So we are dealing with a legacy of all kinds of chronic problems. And this is producing the detrimental effects that we're seeing with young soldiers committing suicide, killing each other, or whatever the case might be. So these are serious issues. But as you noted, if we are going to have a deterrence capacity and use this breathing room, right, to professionalize our military, if we don't address these issues 5 or 10 years from now, we can't be the professional army that we have to protect Armenia's borders and to deter its enemies. So at some point, it's interconnected, but I think it's very important to pay attention to the fact that institutional underdevelopment and a chronic culture that is inherited from the past are one of the main reasons why we are dealing with these severe problems right now.
Okay, I'm going to hark on this one more time. Do we have, because as far as I know, we don't have a national security strategy in place? Because again, as much as we talk about the regional configurations and Russia uh, declining, the US coming in, a new system, incentivization, and all of that, but if we don't fix our own house, all of this becomes moot. So why is it
Definitely.
that we don't have a national security strategy in place?
What we have had in the last 3 years is a roving or a moving national security strategy, but nothing substantively articulated at the policy level. In 2023, the comprehensive security strategy was developed and the government approved it. So we have a concept paper, we have the doctrine, and we have the tenets of it. Since 2023, for inexplicable reasons, our National Security Council has struggled to finalize and implement parts of the comprehensive security doctrine. So the idea is there, the concept is there, it's been approved by the government. The implementation process has been extremely slow. And because of that, nothing has been published, right, the way it should be. So ideas have been around, some concept papers have been, published, things have trickled down, but substantively, to your point, we have not produced what should have been produced at least a year ago. And part of that also is the fact that we already have a national defense strategy, for example, developed. So the MFA has a defense strategy,
The
but a
MFA?
defense strategy, excuse me, I apologize. The MOD has a defense strategy, and MFA has is basically has as an extension of interinstitutional approval has is on board, and MFA is basically aligned also with that and the comprehensive security strategy. So our institutions, generally the big relevant ones that do foreign and security policy, are all on board. The concern is that the MOD has developed its strategy. We have a concept, right, a developed doctrine at the comprehensive level, but the comprehensive security doctrine has not been finalized. And so we do have, to answer your question, the tenets which we are using to strengthen the architecture, but substantively, right, at the institutional level, and we'll come back to the same conversation, we have not produced a doctrine where a citizen could take that piece of paper and say, this is what represents my country's security architecture.
Yeah, I mean, from my part, I've taken part in some conferences here about comprehensive national security, and we've talked about it, you've written about it, whole of government, whole of society, and one of the questions I oftentimes have is, as someone in the media, what is my role? Huh, in this comprehensive security architecture, because in times of crisis, if we have to operationalize every level or every sector of society, we need to be informed of what the expectations are and what our capabilities are, right?
Most definitely. And I would say the whole of society approach, at least from civil society and probably the private sector, is a lot more developed in being able to implement these comprehensive strategies once they are basically finalized. The concern is the whole of government approach, because we just need to have an honest conversation about this. The comprehensive security doctrine works exceptionally well. We've seen in the Baltics, we've seen in the Scandinavian countries. It is the preeminent model for small states. But it has also worked very well because all these countries are developed societies with strong institutions. Comprehensive security cannot work with underdeveloped or incompetent institutions, right? All the parts in the system have to function well for the thing to work at a comprehensive level. So if some parts are underdeveloped or not functioning, the system doesn't operate. And this is the concern that we have, right? So our doctrine is exceptionally strong. Our civil society, private sector are ready to be integrated. It's the underdevelopment of our institutions, institutional capacity, that is slowing down the process. And so when you start looking at that lens, this is why we've said this in the past, why institutional underdevelopment is a national security issue, because we cannot cogently implement our national security doctrine by virtue of those issues. And so that's kind of to answer your question. Whole of society, I think, is categorically ready for this. The whole of government structure is the more complicated part, because in the past we always thought security, that means it's the MOD, right, Ministry of Defense. But MOD cannot do everything, because if it was just the MOD, it won't be comprehensive, right? So now you have all the other apparatuses, and so it's a very complicated process. But to your point. The extent to which Armenia becomes a strong state with deterrence capabilities is hinged on both a very well established doctrine and also an ability to implement and operationalize that doctrine. The operationalization part is what we're struggling with.
Yeah, I mean that has been the constant since independence. I think everything looks good on paper but when it comes to implementation, that's where we falter.
Exactly.
I want to return to the Accords again. I just needed to get that in. So 1 year on, you point to several concrete developments that you're saying it's not only about TRIPP, which we can talk about, but it's the comprehensive strategic partnership with the U.S., the expansion of Armenia's technology sector, and these are all will add to our deterrence capabilities. Now, which of these, or maybe all of them, I don't know, do you think has the greatest strategic impact for Armenia?
I mean, fundamentally, TRIPP will have the most strategic impact in the sense that it is part of a Trans-Caspian route. So it's a subcontinental project that Armenia makes one important strategic part of. And so you have the interests of uh, greater powers who are now investing in this process, right? So in and of itself, TRIPP, that's why I noted, is the cornerstone with respect to why you become important to outside actors, and therefore if there's a threat to you, those actors would step in, right, to deter that threat because they also have vested interests. And so TRIP should be qualified through that lens. But specifically for Armenia, it's very, very straightforward that our more, in the domain of comparative advantage, right, our most important strategic asset is our advanced technology and what we're doing with the AI and data centers and all that stuff, because most don't realize it was the Washington Accords that basically paved the way for Armenia to becoming the AI center of the entire region, right? So Armenia is becoming a tech center, right? A hub for these things by virtue of having access to advanced US technology and all these advanced GPUs and chips. And that only happened after the Accords and through going from a strategic partnership to a comprehensive one. This is why we need to understand the relationship as being systemic and not defined by one project, one building, one statement, so on and so forth. But fundamentally, right, what the Firebird initiative is doing, aside from the economics of it, right, is it's telling the world that Armenia matters to relevant actors. And more so now, the more relevant global actors invest in Armenia, the more important Armenia becomes to them. The more important you are to relevant actor, right, the lower the probability of anybody attacking you, because then they start harming the interests of those actors who have vested interests. So this is kind of the systemic modeling that we're talking about. So most definitely, tech and AI are the at this point strategically more important factors. The second, of course, is going to be mining and critical minerals. Okay, a few years ago at AVN we wrote, mining for security. We introduced the concept. It's being utilized in some of our approach, the Armenian state's approach to these issues. But natural resources are fundamental, right? If a country, right, a set of prominent countries have vested interests in your natural resources, they have access and are partners with you in mining, in critical minerals. Anybody that basically attempts to tamper or harm that also harms their interests. So what you do is you create layers of relevance, right, and multifaceted levels of engagement that basically makes you relevant to all your partners, and they become incentivized, right, at those various levels to offer support should you need it.
I do want to return to Russia like we always do, but before then, I really want to talk about TRIPP. Uh, is there any movement on this at this point?
Yes, there is. We have to understand something. A project of this magnitude has never been implemented in the South Caucasus in the region, and definitely, obviously, not in Armenia. And so the nuances, the complexity of it are kind of very, very broad for a small state like Armenia. For countries like the United States or for the Europeans or China or so on and so forth, Japan, these are small projects, right? But from Armenia's perspective, it's a lot more complicated process, because it's not just an infrastructure project. As we know, it is geopolitical, it's economic, it's geostrategic. There's a lot that comes with it. Okay, so all of those things need to be taken into consideration. But a few things to make clear, right? In the last year, we've seen the entire framework being developed. We've seen the specifics of the structure of how each country is going to approach this, right? We've seen the finalization of the government to government agreement on what the TRIPP corporation is going to look like in Armenia and in the US, okay? And we saw also the development of the TRIPP Enterprise Fund, where the United States is already allocating 400 million to the project, while also setting up a structure where they're going to be bringing in private equity investors, so on and so forth, that's going to go into the billions. These are all movements, right? These are all processes. The construction, technically speaking, is the easy part, because once you have everything set up, right, building a 21 mile or a 43-kilometer physical space isn't the complexity of it, right? It's all the things that come about, and then you go to the building process. And so, also the feasibility study is near completion by the American firm that was sent down. So you've had a multitude of things that have been happening. And so all of these indicate movement. So from that perspective, right, the foundation, the groundwork is being laid. It's merely a matter of months or maybe half a year where we're at the operational stage and building starts. But in that context, just because we haven't broken ground, that doesn't mean there's no movement, right? And kind of, there's a lot of analogies you could play with. Let's say you're planning to build a house, I mean, you go from the financing of it to architecture to engineering to all those things, and then you get approval to build. Okay, so we have to understand through that lens that all of the processes that we are now seeing, while there is no substantive work, physical work on the ground, doesn't mean there's no movement. And the fact that the funding is now being has allocated, and now there's a process of bringing in more money, that's a very important indicator that things in essence are moving.
Okay. Returning back to the geopolitical systems, and you were saying that they tend to endure for about what, 2 decades, I believe you said,
Give or
and
take.
we're, pardon?
Give or take.
Yeah. But in your latest statecraft and governance, which was about the 1 year anniversary, you suggesting that even if Russia eventually recovers from the war in Ukraine, things are settled there, it won't simply be able to return to the South Caucasus because the previous regional order has shifted so dramatically. Um, what has fundamentally changed? I mean, we know what has fundamentally changed, but do you see Russia not being able through other mechanisms, like we're seeing the economic sanctions, the blockade on Armenian products, um, if it can't impose itself on Armenia politically, it's using economic levers. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, nobody's saying Russia is completely impotent or incapable of creating problems in the region. But we're talking about two different things. It's one thing to run the system, it's another thing to be revisionist and create problems in the system. What I was discussing in the article, right, is that the system in the South Caucasus has shifted. It's no longer dominated by Russian hegemony. It's led by the United States and Western partners after the Washington Accords. And that's by virtue of the fact that, as we've discussed extensively, Russia's complete concentration on Ukraine and the diminishing of its resources forced it in the domain of capability to back off of the South Caucasus. Not because it wanted to, is because it lacked the capacity to maintain that system, be that as it may. Now, how long is the Ukraine war going to last? We don't know. Okay, assuming let's say another year, two, three, five, whatever the case might be. The cessation of fighting in Ukraine does not mean the conflict is over, right? That means Russia's geopolitical and regional problems specific to Ukraine and with Europe and with the West is going to continue. That means Russia is going to continue allocating resources on that front. That already alters the dynamic, whereas in the past, prior to 2022, Russia could very easily allocate whatever resources it wanted to the South Caucasus. So, resource allocation is the first thing that we look at when we observe hegemonic or middle power capability. Second, assuming the Ukrainian front is somehow manageable for Russia. Russia has another problem prior to getting to the South Caucasus, and that's Central Asia. And Central Asia is a lot more important to Russia than the South Caucasus. And we're seeing now Kazakhstan engaging what we call, in political science, right, leash slipping, right, where a regional orbit slowly slips from the leash of the regional hegemon, right, whether it's through further engagement with China, whether it's further engagement with the United States, with France, so on and so forth. And so countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan is now starting to garner interest. This doesn't mean all these countries all of a sudden are going to become anti Russia, but what it means is, like Armenia, these countries are starting to exercise more agency and they're slowly disrupting the dependency structure that Russia has created. And so once that this dependency structure diminishes, right, going back and trying to establish dependency in a system is an extremely difficult and time and resource heavy process, right? And so Russia simply cannot step back and say things are going to be the way they are because these countries in the last 5, 10, or 15 years, right, have already developed different capabilities. The rules of the games have changed. They've been playing things differently. Now we come back to the South Caucasus, right? It's the same dynamic. And so let us presume Ukraine is addressed, and at some point Russia is able to address Central Asia, and then they come back to the South Caucasus, right? Again, decade, 2 decade, whatever the case might be. The South Caucasus of 2040 or 2035 is not going to be the South Caucasus of 2015 or 2020. And this is why, should Russia return, You have extensive American vested interests, European vested interests. You have countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia who have developed through whatever iteration their own interests, their own policies, their own arrangements. So Russia would be stepping in into a completely new system, a new rule of the game. It does not mean that Russia will not be able to play in this game or be influential. It most definitely can. But what we are seeing is that it's not going to be a return to the previous Russian hegemony where they got everything they wanted and the actors of the countries in the system were in that dependency structure. Those days are gone. If Russia wants to reestablish that, right, once they're able to return after some time to the South Caucasus, they're also going to need a lot of time to do that. And so these are long-term trajectories, and this is why it's important to understand these at these things at a systemic level, where it's not a question of what Putin wants. It's not a question of what the Kremlin wants. It's a question of what they've lost, how they're able to reposition themselves, and then what are they going to do to reestablish themselves. These are long-term processes that we're going to see.
Hmm. Now, what developments, in your opinion, could begin to unravel the security environment that we are now in, created by the Washington Accords? I mean, let's talk about Iran, Turkey. What are some of the things that the unforeseen risks to all of this?
There are, right. We could talk about numerous black swan iterations. One very, very simple. Let's say, for example, in 2028, we have elections in the United States, and a Democratic Party comes in. We've spoken about this. There's going to be institutional continuity, but what if they deprioritize the South Caucasus? Not the United States isn't going to leave a system that is dominating, right? But let us assume they deprioritize, and they're like, you know what? After 5 years, we've taught you kids how to play the game. Now you guys go do your thing, okay? And then Azerbaijan views that as sort of a reason to start engaging in the old behavior that it did. That's one possibility, right? Obviously, Armenia has to. We've anticipated that we're going to engage in risk mitigation and blah blah blah. But I'm just sort of that is the simplest scenario where, okay, if that happens, we need to anticipate that. Okay, but that could be a controlled or addressed for. There are, of course, broader, as you noted, geopolitical developments that could be completely outside of Armenia's capability. The Iran conflict is a one that we've been speaking about for a while. Iran understands that harming relations with Armenia it's against its own strategic interests. Therefore, they have been very, very careful and very sensitive to the South Caucasus. But we're also not seeing a resolution to the quagmire between the United States and Iran. And so the persistence of this conflict can at one point lead to an unexpected escalation. And the problem with escalation is that once things start spiraling, that's when all these black swan events start where you can't control for things. So one possibility, right, is this conflict, for example, getting out of control, in which case if you have a broad regional war, nobody cares about TRIPP at that point, right? And that completely changes the dynamic because now the South Caucasus becomes sort of a collateral thing, undergoes collateral damage or becomes a basically a casualty of broader subcontinental developments. That's very likely possible. Okay, we're recently seeing growing antagonization between Turkey and Israel. Okay, Syria is becoming a very, very serious sticking point. Okay, is that going to lead to further antagonization, or are you going to see some kind of a Cold War developing in the region? How does Azerbaijan position in that conflict, right? And what are the implications of that for Armenia? And so these regional, and what if that, for example, escalates into a hot conflict between Turkey and Israel, right? What does that produce for our region? And United States' dynamic will definitely change in the both in the Middle East and South Caucasus if Turkey and Israel go towards a possibility of kinetic conflict. So these are things that we also are considering, and of course, generally speaking, regional wars have what we call a leakage problem. They tend to leak there's a spillover conflict that smaller states can get harmed. So all of these dynamics, right, absolutely are things that need to be considered and addressed. But in the domain, right, and speaking purely as a political scientist who engages in all this risk mitigation modeling, in the domain of risk, all of those are minimal risks. The biggest risk that we face with respect to TRIP's success and the and Armenia's a capacity to maximize its gains under the new U.S.-led post-Washington Accord system is our institutional underdevelopment. That poses a greater risk than all the other black swan scenarios that we are talking about.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold, not a bold statement, almost a frightening statement that we will once again shoot ourselves in the foot if we don't get our own house in order and we don't build those institutions the way we want to. Um, I don't know. I want to also, I have more questions about that, but internally, Azerbaijan, we're not talking about what's going on in Azerbaijan. Are there any risks domestically, or does Aliyev still have a very strong grip on power today? Could anything in Azerbaijan upend this whole process?
No, Aliyev's power is absolute in Azerbaijan. So, in that context, there is no opposition, there's no civil society, there's no factionalism. He rules like a god. So, in that context, there are no domestic developments that could in any way rupture these aspects. Okay, one possible scenario is if you have, an organic unanticipated uprising in Azerbaijan, which is not uncommon in authoritarian regimes, in which case if the regime goes into pure survival mode, then the whole wag the dog, rally around the flag, initiate a conflict with Armenia might come about, in the sense that Aliyev will make the calculation, either I survive or I reinitiate conflict with Armenia, and TRIPP is secondary to my survival. So if we get into an extreme scenario like that, that is one possibility. The second, even though Olive seems to be rather healthy physically, let's say, something happens and he passes away quickly. Then you have a power transition issue in Azerbaijan. And that's where it can get very, very complicated because highly centralized systems, right, tend to implode, and the decentralization process does create chaos. And so, if that happens, hypothetically, you would see potentially problems as well. But overall, the ruling elite in Azerbaijan view the United States a lot more favorably than a Russian dominated system. The ruling elite understand that as long as they're able to maintain their relatively corrupt, authoritarian political and economic model domestically, they would much rather work with the West than having to do the aggressive or difficult transactionalism with Russia or other authoritarian countries. So, in that sense, assuming even if there's a power transition or chaos or whatever, breakdown of the Aliyev system, whoever assumes power is still going to prefer, right, US and Western engagement as opposed to sort of, the underdevelopment and the problematic nature of having a Russian dominated South Caucasus.
And coming back to, as we say, to our own ducks, if you will, um, I know what the easy answer is, but let me ask it anyway. I mean, what should Armenian policymakers be doing with this opportunity? And where should the government's priorities be, over the next 5 to 10 years? Obviously, building institutions, but are there other areas where they should be concentrating on?
Well, I mean, you do these things in parallel. You cannot prioritize one over the other. Everything has to be done in a systemic fashion. Definitely, number one priority should be economic growth and economic development. That is the only thing that has allowed Armenia to survive, considering the immensely impossible security situation that we've been in. And the economy is doing relatively well. But considering the Russia dynamic, considering the fact that the Eurasian Economic Union might create or become problematic for Armenia, the number one priority in this specific domain is finding more markets, developing a broader dehybridization tool where the Russian hybrid attacks do not have the relative adverse effect that we can't control for, and basically maintaining economic growth, especially the fact that we have a service sector economy with AI, tech, finance, tourism, so on and so forth. In parallel, of course, it has to be military modernization. Okay, our defense modernization has to be all, and these go hand in hand with economic growth because you can't have military modernization without the economic capacity, right? Military modernization is the key. We speak of reforms. Reforms are necessary to allow for modernization. So, in that context, if we don't modernize our military in this time period that we have, we're going to find ourselves in the same situation because we can have a very robust and healthy economy. But if our military capacity, being in the neighborhood that we are regardless of the system, because as I noted, systems are ephemeral, right? This is something that we need to consider extensively. So, economy and robust deterrence capabilities should be the number one priority areas for our policymakers. Everything else is obviously interconnected to this, but the main attention is specific to those. And of course, the rest is all about managing crisis, developing resiliency, and addressing whatever shocks that may come. Whether it's Russia's approach to, economy and energy, to regional instability, to conflict, broader wars that may break out throughout the region. As far as us having agency, these are the areas internally that we could move very quickly on and to address the problems that we have.
You mentioned Nerses economic resiliency, making sure that the economy stays on track. Now, Armenia finds itself a member, finds itself is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And now it has the prime minister announced that Armenia will be pursuing EU membership. So this puts Armenia in a very complex situation where the Russians are saying, well, you have to make a decision. You can't be sitting in two chairs at once. And Europe has stepped in after Russia's blockade on certain Armenian products, but this is not a systemic solution. How is Armenia going to be navigating these two very different paths?
Well, Armenia understands that Eurasian Economic Union does not really have a future. That it, more than anything, even it has some economics, it is the political structure. The fact that Russia is weaponizing it is a case in point. Also, the countries that are we see within the Eurasian Economic Union are all developing or underdeveloped economies. So, in that context, there isn't much future in there. Now, diversification obviously stipulates opening other markets. Armenia has been accessing, the Gulf countries, Middle East markets, and obviously seeking markets in Europe. You cannot have sufficient access to European markets if you're not part of the EU accession process, where you're engaging in deeper negotiations, having deeper reforms, and having basically deeper involvement with the Europeans. So, if we take the politics out of this, the Prime Minister's announcement is just another indicator that Armenia is going to do everything it can to become integrated into European markets. That is in the national interest of Armenia. Now, whether the Europeans want you to become a member or not, that's a different subject of conversation. We know very well, those who study these things take at least 20 years. Now, you might have political situations like Ukraine or Moldova where they might speed up the process, but those are going to be artificial processes because if your country is not ready to be in the European single market and you're going to be, part of the EU in name, but you're not going to get the euro for God knows how long. I mean, these are things to have honest conversations about. But I think at the economic level, it makes all the sense for me to take this position because if we want further access, right, to European markets, we have to go down this trajectory. Now, the Eurasian Economic Union, we understand, is totally capped for us, and we cannot be subjected to its weaponization. So, Armenia has to manage this issue with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union to make the transition a lot smoother and less antagonistic. And Yerevan has been attempting to de antagonize. But to suggest that we can't upset the Russians, therefore we're going to stop any conversations of EU accession, contradicts Armenia's national interest. At the same time, I mean, there's also the possibility that official Yerevan can leverage the EU process to tell the Russians, please tone it down. In the sense that Armenia understands it's going to take us a long time, and if we get there, to be an EU member. And so, if there is this sort of tacit, realistic understanding that Armenia could never be an EU member, maybe the Russians will understand that this is maybe a leveraging move by the Armenians. Let us tone down our aggressive or sanction esque approach. But that's the politics in kind of approaching this. So to kind of address your question, it is in Armenia's economic interest to tilt towards the European markets. They're bigger, they're wealthier, And in essence, right, all countries that are integrated into European supply chains and in the European economy develop much faster than any other economic system.
And what about the opening of the Armenia-Turkey border is obviously going to impact this as well, because if we're talking about, exporting Armenian products to Europe, and you only have, the route through Georgia, this is ridiculous. There seems to be a lot of chatter, but really no concrete movement in that regard. And, we've written about this and you've written about this, and we keep talking about this, how Ankara sort of is Ankara waiting for green light from Baku. At this point, every time we hear, oh, something is going to happen in a few months, we just roll our eyes and we move on.
Right. So clearly, interconnectivity and opening of borders are necessary. You can't be EU candidate, never mind a potential member, in the domain of being blockaded. And so this is why the new US-led system is so crucial to Armenia's future aspirations, because the system does demand opening of borders, interconnectivity, and trade. And so at some point, right, Azerbaijan would have to play that game. Turkey is a different dynamic. For the longest time, everybody knows I've been a very big skeptic on the opening or the normalization of Turkish U.S. relations. But that's before the U.S. became a dominant actor in the South Caucasus. So we are seeing some shifts of movement. The Kars Gyumri Railway is a big part of the conversation. Europeans have already offered a couple of billions to rebuild that, and they're incentivizing the Turks to basically also participate. So we're seeing some movement. But to your point, the economic conversation, the interconnectivity argument, you're always going to win that. And the Turks agree that that's a good conversation. The politics and the geopolitics of it is where it gets complicated. Now, the broader discourse is we have to wait until Turkey's elections, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, if Erdogan wins, doesn't matter how he wins, right? Assuming he wins, okay, is it going to be business as usual, or Erdogan's going to understand the fact that his last term, he's no longer going to be held hostage to Aliyev's indirect blackmail, and he's going to do what is in the economic interests of basically Eastern Turkey, and thus open borders and also make his European partners and American partners happy? Is that going to be the approach? Or if Erdogan loses, right, and it's very, very straightforward, the opposition is going to be a lot more pro West, and they will be a lot quicker in opening borders or initiating normalization. Again, these are broader hypotheticals, okay? But until elections, we're not going to see much movement, because for the reasons, as you know, and the reasons that we all know, okay, Armenia is not the hill that Erdogan's going to die on when it comes to Aliyev's influence in the AKP party of Erdogan's, and Aliyev's extensive influence in regional areas where he has provided extensive funding and support for Erdogan's party. So this is going to be basically, we can have a healthier conversation about this post Turkish elections.
Okay, well, Nerses, thank you for this conversation. I want to say that a year from now, when we speak every month, but a year from now, hopefully, TRIPP will be something that we can actually physically see. Uh, and there will be movement in that regard, and it will be interesting, like you said. I mean, it's very interesting to see how the American elections midterms are going to play out, how that's going to impact us. And my concern always is that, are we ready in Yerevan to be able to navigate these constant changes? I'm hoping that there's somebody sitting and doing some risk mitigation and some scenario planning.
We're learning how to be ready. We're much better than what we used to be, but it's always a steep curve, and we are having positive movement. But everybody knows how difficult geopolitics are, and now we're adding another layer of domestic American politics into that complexity. So this is definitely a fun game from an academic perspective, but a very dangerous and difficult game for practitioners.
Right. I mean, it's like you said, it's a mental exercise, but for the people of Armenia and for our own security and safety and future, these things are critical. And hopefully, we will learn on that steep curve as fast as we can.
One of the secrets we've had is deeper engagement in DC. And so that has been a very, very important factor, at least in the
Mm.
last 2 years, in allowing Armenia to navigate America's engagement and role in the South Caucasus. And I think we need to enhance and amplify that. And the work's being done to achieve those. So in the broader scheme of things, we're playing on various levels that in the past we haven't played at. But we're still small players in a very, very big field.
And sometimes we forget how small we are. We think that we're so important to Turkey and so important to Iran and so important to Brussels or DC. We have to prove that importance, I think, and you prove that by having strong institutions and smart leadership. Yeah.
Most definitely.
Okay. Thanks, Nerses.